Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ji-young Kim from Hanyang University, and welcome to Panel 6, The Evolution and Sustainability of U.S. ROK Japan Cooperation. It is my great pleasure to serve as a moderator for this panel. I believe this panel is particularly meaningful because it brings together distinguished scholars from South Korea, U.S., and Japan to discuss trilateral cooperation from each country's perspectives. Our speakers will examine the historical evolution and recent development of trilateral cooperation while also addressing the structural factors shaping this relationship, including North Korea nuclear issue, China's growing influence, and changes in U.S. alliance strategy. Okay, so before we begin, let me briefly explain the format of today's session. Each presenters will have 15 minutes for their presentation. After all presentations are completed, each discussant will have 10 minutes for comments. So if time permits, we'll conclude with brief Q&A session with the audience. So as a moderator, my primary responsibility is to keep us on schedule. So I may give you a time reminder when speakers have few minutes reminding, and I may need to intervene if necessary. I appreciate your cooperation and understanding. So let us begin. Our first speaker is today. The order is changed a bit, so Dr. Oh In-hwan from East Asia Institute will present his research first. Dr. Oh In-hwan, please.
Can you hear me? All right. Thank you, Professor Kim, for moderating. Thank you to KAIS and the Korea Foundation for convening this panel. It's a great pleasure and privilege to share my thoughts on trilateral cooperation among Korea, US, and Japan, alongside distinguished panelists from the US and Japan. In this short piece, I argue that the existing trilateral is being asked to do something that it was not designed to do in the past, whether that be the Cold War period or even after the Cold War. Namely, that is to deliver a certain level of strategic convergence during a multidimensional US-China power transition, while also managing the sovereignty games, which I call, of Korea and Japan constructively at the same time. And the trilateral architecture, trilateral architecture inherited from the San Francisco Treaty System faces two simultaneous pressures. At the system level, there is a multidimensional US-China power transition, and that is unfolding across nuclear, naval, conventional military economy, and frontier technology domains. At the unit level, the different sovereignty games of Korea and Japan, which were in part kept in check by US leadership, have moved into a different mode and are now interacting with this multifaceted US-China power transition. Though I haven't articulated it fully in this piece, we also have to think about North Korea's nuclear armament and strategic reorientation. So what happened in the first half of this year, including North Korea's two hostile states doctrine in party and constitutional law, South Korea's recalibrated response called peaceful coexistence, and Japan's lifting of its lethal weapons export ban, along with a renewed drive to amend Article 9 of Japan's constitution. These are not just background noise to the trilateral story. I believe they are the sovereignty games moving visibly into active mode. And so central argument I put forward is that we need a recalibration in which US-Japan architecture is carefully redesigned around these three conditions or variables: US-China power transition, and sovereign games of Korea and Japan, and allied industrial capacity. With the last, allied industrial capacity serving as the hinge domain where the first two can be made to align. So my analytical framework draws on the theoretical work of Professor Jae Sung-jeon, Professor at Seoul National University and President of the East Asia Institute, on Northeast Asian international relations, particularly as developed in his 2020 book. So his main claim is that Northeast Asian states play two games simultaneously. The one is what we know well, the international politics games. That is the typical reals game of survival, security, and power maximization among sovereign states. But the second game we also play is the sovereignty game, which is the prior, more ontological dynamics of becoming a complete modern sovereign state. And Korea and Japan have distinct forms of incompleteness in terms of sovereignty, as we know well. Korea exhibits division type incompleteness in terms of sovereignty. We have divided territory, divided nation, governments that legally claim sovereignty over the entire peninsula, but exercise effective control only over the half of the peninsula, and which is similar to the case with China and Taiwan. Japan exhibits constitutional different type of incompleteness of sovereignty. Article 9 of the post-war constitution, unresolved status of Okinawa, and the absence of peace treaty with Russia and North Korea. And now North Korea is trying to withdraw the terms of Korea's division from above, while Japan is attempting to dissolve its constitutional constraint from within. And we have had the hub and spoke system that has constrained this sovereignty games of Korea-Japan since the San Francisco Treaty, underpinned by the US leadership and commitment. But as the US begins to reconsider its role in the region and the hub and spoke system, or at a minimum to take a step back, the hub has weaker weight to suppress or rechannel the sovereignty games of its spokes. And the spokes, particularly Korea and Japan, discover that resources required to advance their sovereignty completions are increasingly available in the very same industrial and technological domains that the recalibrating leading power now demands they contribute to the alliance. So this year's development on the peninsula and in Tokyo are visible expressions of those double sovereignty games. So I will skip the part of the multidimensional US-China power transition because we know what's happening between US-China well, but I would like to just highlight the naval dimension is the most visible. China has surpassed the US in the number of battle force ships sometime between 2015 and 2020, and due to their asymmetric shipbuilding capacity, the production gap between the United States and China is projected to continue to widen. And I would like to also just briefly note that the conventional military and nuclear dimension and economic dimension and frontier technology dimension as a part of this multifaceted US-China power transition. And if this systemic level provides a pressure for trilateral recalibration, the unit level supplies both the resources and challenges. It is at the unit level that the development of 2026 this year most directly intervened. Korea's sovereignty game today extends beyond just familiar objectives of its pursuit of a peace regime on the Korean Peninsula acceptable to the Korean people, because the first aspect is securing structural assurances that a normalized Japan will not pursue an expansionist or aggressive regional posture. I mean, the second aspect. So this second aspect is something we don't consider enough when we think about South Korea's sovereignty game. And Japan's sovereignty game today operates under a transformed structural environment, and this year it has taken its most consequential steps in the post-war era. In April, the Takaichi cabinet revised the three principles of transfer of defense equipment and technology to lift the long-standing prohibition on exporting lethal weapons, fighter jets, missiles, and warships, ending a restraint that has stood in various forms since 1967. And second, building on the LDP Japan Innovation Party supermajority won in the last February lower house election, Takaichi has made an explicit push to amend Article 9 and formally stipulate the self-defense forces in the Constitution. And so when South Korea and Japan pursue these distinct sovereign games, friction may emerge from incompatible ontological securities. I think it is out there. It's not it hasn't fully materialized yet, but if not carefully handled by the recalibrated trilateral cooperation or consultation, it may reemerge and it will come up at some point. And so the same conditions, US-China power transition, recalibration, combined with this two distinct types of sovereignty games of Korea and Japan are the conditions under which we see these challenges and also the opportunities for a recalibration of the trilateral cooperation. And I suggest that the allied industrial capacity is the hinge domain where we could think of a better cooperation and recalibrated trilateral architecture. This is because it is the dimension in which Korea's and Japan's sovereign completions or games can complement U.S. strategic needs rather than undermine the alliance. So Korea's sovereign completion drives supplies the naval defense and dual-use industrial capacity that the U.S. now requires to maintain maritime dominance against China. And Japan's sovereignty and completion drive, now including a fully liberalized defense export posture, supplies the precision manufacturing, systems integration, frigate export capacity that U.S. naval reconstitution requires. When these contributions are channeled through a well-designed architecture, the sovereignty games and the international politics game converge productively, and when they are left undesigned, they can fragment into Korea-Japan industrial competition, U.S. allied transactional disputes, and China's economic coercion against the weakest industrial link. So I have all the details in the short piece, but in the interest of time, I trust I get my point across. I won't get into details of the principles of a recalibrated trilateral architecture I laid out in the piece, but I will just note that the principles I suggest for the recalibration of the trilateral are hierarchical recalibration, not hierarchical preservation of the existing system, and sovereignty-sensitive integration, and resilience against economic statecraft and strategic fragmentation. And I will move on to, I think I have still some time to elaborate some of the principles, so we'll talk about it briefly more. The first principle is hierarchical recalibration rather than hierarchical preservation. The trilateral must accept that the United States is no longer the sole industrial center of the alliance. The new architecture should institutionalize graduated leadership across domains, U.S. command authority and frontiers research and development, Korean naval industrial scale and defense export capacity, Japanese precision manufacturing, systems integration, and design depth. I think the examples of the ICE Pact, MASCA, and the bridge strategy of America's Maritime Action Plan can serve as templates in this recalibration. The second principle is sovereignty-sensitive integration that takes into account consideration of how to manage sovereignty games constructively. Industrial integration must be designed so that neither Korea's nor Japan's sovereignty completion narrative is forced to subordinate to the other. This is more demanding than it sounds, but the 2026 developments make it more urgent. Japan's entry into lethal weapons export markets directly overlaps South Korea's hard-won defense export niche, and absent deliberate design, the two normalizations will collide commercially even as they are meant to reinforce one another strategically. It is well exemplified among the relations between Korea, United States, Japan, and Australia in particular. The third principle is resilience against economic statecraft and strategic fragmentation. Allied industrial capacity needs redundancy and depth precisely because China has now demonstrated willingness to weaponize commercial sanctions against allied industrial integration. Potential Chinese economic coercion or statecraft may target Japanese precision equipment export. I think it has already targeted Japanese industry after the Takaichi's remark regarding the Taiwan recently. Korean battery and semiconductor export as well. So trilateral industrial architecture must be designed for resilience under coercion, which means redundant production capacity across multiple allied jurisdictions, the diversified critical material sourcing, because China controls about 90% of initial phase of processing of raw earth materials, and joint preparation for coordinated economic response. The NATO IP4 framework may provide one institutional framework. It is a loose framework rather than an institution through which middle powers can collectively shape rather than passively absorb this recalibration. So I will close by summarizing my suggestion. First, the trilateral's current challenges are foreseeable result of a structural condition in which original architectures of the San Francisco Treaty systems of some assumptions might not have seen during the time. And diagnosing the situation correctly is a precondition for any durable response. Second, Korea's and Japan's sovereignty gains should be taken as structural realities. It is underlying, unseen at this point, but it is out there to be incorporated into architecture's design. North Korea's hostile two-state turn and Japan's normalization are not anomalies to be wished away. We have to treat them as constructive, constitutive features that opens the possibility of redesigning architecture that channels them productively. Lastly, allied industrial capacity is the hinge domain in which the multidimensional US-China power transition, South Korea's and Japan's sovereignty, competition energies, and the US formative rules recalibration can be made to align. Only if the trilateral is consciously redesigned rather than left to drift through ad hoc industrial combination. So the next trilateral architecture will only be sustainable if all three parties accept that previous hierarchy or previous institution hierarchy is now means, not the end as in the past, and that the end is the collective management of an order that none of us alone or together can fully command. I will stop here. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Oh. The key message Dr. Oh tried to deliver, that I believe that the future of U.S. ROK Japan cooperation depends on redesigning, not simply preserving the trilateral architecture to reflect today's changing security environment. Thank you very much. And our second speaker is Professor Ryo Sashi from University of Tokyo, and he will share the Japanese perspectives on U.S. ROK-Japan relations. Professor Sashi, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and it is my great pleasure to come here and to join this panel. I really grateful and thank you very much for KAIS and also Korea Foundation for the support. So I want to speak a little bit about my own perspective on Japan-US ROK triangle and also Japan-ROK bilateral relations. And I start to be really pessimistic about the situation today because I think my point is a little bit different from Dr. Cronin, because even though I admit the really big challenge by the rise of China, and I also believe, as you say, most of sensible people in Washington and also in US military share your perspective on the real challenge from rising China. But the political force which has stayed in Washington and also in the United States might not make the same conclusion on the US commitment to this region. So we start to wonder whether the US commitment to this region is sustainable or not, or credible or not. So I think in this point, South Korea and Japan start to share some anxiety, but also, please don't take me wrong, we also understand the strategic importance of the United States. So we, both two countries, South Korea and Japan, try to stay in the US alliance network. But I think it is very important, the very big worries we have, especially in Tokyo, we have about the US commitment in the region. So I think some people, you can stay. I can move my slide. Yeah. So some people from Japan sometimes say we, in Japan, should use some leverage vis-a-vis United States. And these people say we now have to make kind of leverage against the United States. So like in the economic security, we can make a leverage and we have to make some threats against the United States. But this is not what I want to say. Even though we share the anxiety, and we have very big anxiety, but our strategy, consensus, is still hugging the alliance. So I think it is very difficult to see from the outside of Tokyo, but some really long messages are always coming out now, even from the Tokyo people, on the delicacy or delicate, the discussion we have. So we have big anxiety, but we didn't change our strategy. So that is the root of our dilemma, right? But I think it is really, interesting moment for us. Okay, next slide, maybe this one. No, this one. But anyway, so, but at the same time, I strongly believe we two countries, Japan and the United States, Japan, South Korea, share the basic perspective. And we two countries have a really good in relations. I was really pleased to see two prime ministers and president met again and again in Nara and in Andong, and they still keep the really good friendship to each other. And from my perspective, we really appreciate President Lee Jae-myung came to Japan before going to Washington in last August. And in addition to that, it was really good to take a note. After Iranian war, Japan, South Korea, two governments cooperated to evacuate our citizens. So we have MOU to each other. So in Japan's flight, in the flights, aircraft, we prepared, some South Korean citizens joined. And of course, for the aircraft South Korean government prepared, some Japanese also got board. And I watch very carefully about the people reaction to such exchange of, how can I say, friendship or exchange of behaviors. Almost nobody resisted. In the past, many Japanese hawkish people say, oh no, why we have to save South Korean citizens? But this time, I almost didn't find out such a negative opinions. So I think this is a really good evidence from Japanese, community or citizens. But I think I sense the same thing happened here. So I'm going to dive into a public opinion survey later, but I think our situation is really good in public opinions too, not only in government level, but also in public opinion. But I think that new stage of relationship came from the fact of sharing anxiety to the United States. So where the anxiety come from is, from my perspective, from our perspective, China policy. But I think for South Korean perspective, Korean Peninsula and US commitment to the Korean Peninsula. So this is very interesting. We have different reasons, to have anxiety on the United States and President Trump. But since our worry is really deep, we can share the anxiety at a really deep level. So from my perspective, from our perspective of Japan, we still have big worries about Trump's commitment to China-Taiwan question. Yes, the President Trump didn't make any big change on Taiwan policy last time after the summit meeting in Beijing. But like in Hawk's interview, his way of presentation of one China policy is a little bit changing from the traditional line of presentation. And to make things worse, we cannot find out a kind of source of confidence of his commitment to Taiwan and the security of Taiwan Strait. So, we still have very deep worries about, his commitment and his administration commitment to China policy and Taiwan policy. Of course, we also have big worries about US commitment to Korean Peninsula. At least, we don't believe NDS or NSS are the documents we still have to believe in. Right? So we simply don't believe such a documentation or documents as credible signaling from the United States. We really have to keep our worries on US behavior, by behavior. So then I want to share some new public opinion in Japan and South Korea. And the reason why is, the recent public survey from Yomiuri Shimbun and Hankuk Ilbo really shows, we two countries share the perspective and anxiety on President Trump. But at the same time, the survey also showed two countries really need trilateral cooperation, not only bilateral cooperation. This was very interesting for me, because as this graph showed, two countries have a really strong belief to each other. And even Takaichi's receive a higher favorability in Korea than President Trump. Of course, it is 25% versus 15%, but still, it was really eye-opening. And, because President Takaichi Sanae has been regarded as very hawkish, but she succeeded in, gaining such a favorable image for the eyes of South Korean. Of course, that might be helped by, President Trump's negative image here, but at the same time, Sanae Takaichi's, commitment to bilateral relations works very well. But in addition to that, as I said, common shared anxiety to the regional situation really help Takaichi to gain such favorability, I believe. But according to the survey, many South Koreans are still hesitant to have higher level of commitment to bilateral security cooperation with Japan. And they prefer a trilateral security cooperation. So this is very interesting, because I believe South Korean people don't like so much about President Trump, and they favor Prime Minister Takaichi, but they try to keep trilateral security cooperation more than bilateral cooperation with Japan. So why? This is still very mysterious for me. So here is two hypotheses. I cannot test because the data is very insufficient. But I really believe these two hypotheses are really valuable. Hypothesis A is two countries still want to hug the United States. So if two countries simply make the bilateral security cooperation stronger, leaving the trilateral security cooperation behind, that might end up giving up the United States or signaling the United States you are not welcomed here. But but the public in two countries really has a good sense of security, and they try to hug the United States. They really want to keep the United States here. That is hypothesis A. It is, I think it makes sense to some people, and I really believe, this is really important to test this hypothesis A. But hypothesis B is I think this hypothesis is only applicable to South Korean public. But South Korean people start to have more warm feeling to Japan, but they still hesitate to believe Japan as security partner. So even though they start to have a better image of Japan, but they cannot believe Japan as a security partner. Of course, President Lee Jae-myung recently denied the idea of AXA in public. We are really shocked by that. But I think it was also, kind of evidence evidence of, kind of hesitation to deepen the security partnership with Japan. So I think, I think this might be a kind of East Asian culture, right? Before having a very big decision, the final moment, we just stop and wonder or ponder, this is a right decision or not. And for South Korean public, I think this is kind of final hesitation, final moment to decide. So this is my hypothesis B. I don't know what is, I don't have enough data at this moment to test this hypothesis, but I think in the future we can test these two hypotheses. And from the public opinion survey, I just want to suggest the final one. This is relating to North Korean issue, but it was really interesting and striking to me. That is, in Japan, many people, more people, want to have dialogue with North Korea than pressure. So the point, 9-point plus, was shown in the recent survey. So I cannot understand why, because Prime Minister Takaichi is conservative politician, but still, she says, we have to make a dialogue with North Korea and Kim Jong-un. But, public really shows, how can I say, strong, motivation to dialogue with South Korea without any progress at this moment. So it was very interesting for me. Okay, this is just a kind of very small, short summary of the survey. But what I wanted to stress the most is, I think trilateral relationship is still very important. First of all, we two countries, even though we share, South Korea and Japan share the anxiety, we really need the United States. But the reason why is not only from, I can say, national security needs, but also from maybe our sense of security. Our own judgment, US, we have to hug the United States and don't let United States out from this region. And finally, I just want to add just one thing, which has not been printed here in the PowerPoint. But I think after listening to Dr. Oh's presentations, and I really want to see, stronger Japan, US, South Korea trilateral relationship, but also Japan, South Korea bilateral security relationship. But I think the real difficult issue might be coming from our defense, defense transformation by the end of this year. And I still don't know. Because I was a little bit eye-opened by Dr. Oh's presentations and his articles here. And yes, Japan tried to make use of the strategic opportunity now in front of us. And Japan will publish our national security strategy and defense strategy by the end of this year. But reportedly, and as far as I know, what we will do is a really big change of strategic platform, including more defense budget, but maybe more importantly, we start to have very robust Indo-Pacific security, Indo-Pacific defense, we say. Including, we have more radar system in Ogasawara Islands and like that. So we will have more, capabilities, not only in Fast Island chain, but also in wider region. So I think the challenge might be, will South Korea really understand and accept our expanding security roles in the region? And recently, I started to hear some negative voice opinions from South Korea. That is, Japan is making use of strategic vacuum US start to create. And Japan start to fill the vacuum for its own sake. They didn't say this is a demilitarization or demilitarism of Japan, but I think this might be a real big challenge by the end of this year or maybe next year. So this is just my thought. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Sahashi, for your thought-provoking presentation. I guess one of your central insights of your presentation is that growing uncertainty about U.S. regional commitment has encouraged both South Korea and Japan to place even greater value on trilateral cooperation. And also you add at the end that there will be some big changes in Japan's defense strategy and how it will affect Japan-South Korea relationship will be kind of will be discussed by actually our discussant, Dr. Cho. Okay, so our last presenter will be Dr. Patrick Cronin from Hudson Institute, and he will present the American perspectives on U.S. ROK-Japan relations. Professor Cronin, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I used to teach a course about the theory and practice of alliance politics at Johns Hopkins University. And after teaching it a number of years, I realized that there was this huge gap between theory and practice. One of the great books in modern times on alliance theory was written by Stephen Walt, who argued that alliances come together to balance threatening power. Under that theory, our three countries ought to be moving forward to deal with growing uncertainties and challenges on the peninsula, from China and the region and beyond. But what I've heard on this panel, what I've heard in previous panels here at this conference, is that a lot of the anxiety is about the United States. It's about the uncertainty of the role of the United States. So we are not living up to theory. It works in practice, but not in theory. And so I'm here to allay some of those anxieties, but I can't dismiss them. I can't say they're not legitimate concerns. I can only say, in my judgment, they're not as serious as they seem. The United States is more committed to the balance of power in Asia. It's more committed to the defense of Japan and South Korea. It's more committed still to maintaining peace across the Taiwan Strait, even under what has been reduced to Trump 2.0. It's not Trump 2.0. It's an 80-year-old man named Donald Trump, who is the president in his second term. There's a certain limited shelf life on that policy. It's very individualistic. It's not really telling about what Professor Sahashi mentioned as the reasonable people in Washington, D.C., in the establishment. And I happen to think that that view is actually the dominant view going forward, even in this Trump 2.0. Anyway, my points in support of this is first to recognize that trilateral cooperation has become more of a necessity than a luxury. For both security and technological and economic reasons, there really is no way that our three countries individually could successfully do as much to protect our individual national interests as we can do by cooperating together. Now, getting to the cooperation is problematic, as we all know, but that's my judgment. Secondly, the political foundation for cooperation is stronger right now because the two bilateral alliances between the United States and Japan and US and South Korea remain very institutionalized and strong, and the weak link has always been between Seoul and Tokyo. And yet we see now, with this return to shuttle diplomacy, the reciprocal leader visits, there is new momentum. Even if it's maybe going to change after December, we'll see what South Korea's reaction is to Japan's transformation. I would argue on behalf of Japan here to a South Korean audience that not to listen to the critics who see this as filling a strategic vacuum. Well, they may be feeling a need to step in where the United States is stepping aside. That's a legitimate stepping in, I think. But don't think that this is some kind of new militarism, that Japan of 2026 is somehow the imperial Japan of a very long gone era. Because if you look at what the actions that imperial Japan took today, those are the kinds of actions that we see much more out of China, even with its desire to play a more, build a more tributary system maybe than an empire. Nonetheless, it's the one that's expanding the need for control, setting the rules, making bigger influence across the region. So it's not Japan. So I actually think that younger Koreans in particular will see that as a reality, that Japan is not the threat to their interests. Japan is an opportunity here. And we saw this at the Shangri-La, I saw it at the Shangri-La Dialogue with the three defense ministers meeting. It's a misnomer. I've seen it in one of the comments that somehow President Trump doesn't believe in minilateralism. Well, that's true, but he happens to actually believe in this trilateral. This is the exception to the rule. And so it's an important distinction to mention. Even President Trump sees the value of this minilateralism. Thirdly, the strengthening of deterrence against North Korea is an immediate priority. And the more we can do to try to work the tough issue of extended deterrence, especially if we have OPCON transition, especially if we're dealing with more questions about growing conventional capabilities of our allies and trying to integrate them into the existing alliance, this is going to be a huge challenge because North Korea nuclear programs are going in one direction. They may slow down, but they're still heading in one direction. I think trilateral cooperation is going to contribute directly to the Indo-Pacific, and I say that at the same time that the United States has just renamed the Indo-Pacific Command back to just the Pacific Command. So all the more reason why Japan ought to be keeping alive the idea of Indo-Pacific, because the United States is sending not weak signals, but mixed signals, in my view, on something like the Quad and the cooperation with India. On the one hand, after the G7 in France, Prime Minister Modi and President Trump looked like it was howdy Modi time again, to use a phrase that was struck when Prime Minister Modi had visited Houston several years ago and got along famously with President Trump, as they did last February when Prime Minister Modi visited President Trump in the White House. That relationship is faced more headwinds than it deserves. It's actually strategically more sound and more supported than is widely known. And I think that it is also a reason why Japan pushing the Indo-Pacific, keeping India in there, even though it's always been an offense in South Korea, right? That Indo-Pacific meant, wait, where's Asia? Where's Korea? A legitimate grievance, a legitimate question, but the answer was not to delete Korea. It was to add India into the region as a broader counterweight and to think about demographic needs and to think about other industrial capabilities. And I think that remains a common interest of these countries. So just as working more with Australia will be important, and there was a very good report done out of the National Bureau of Asian Research with Zach Cooper and others just recently, looking at the possibility of a quadrilateral extended deterrence kind of format. The alliance must adapt to the changing character of warfare. My friend Paul Shari has an excellent article out in the latest issue of Foreign Affairs, the July-August issue, called Losing the War of the Future. And he makes it very clear when you're doing a net assessment of what it takes to have a favorable military balance, that you better be counting something different that hasn't been counted in the past. And that's the digital components, essentially, of your architecture. And that includes your ability for have compute power, but also sensors, radars, the algorithms, things that are very hard to quantify maybe, but are necessary. And it's Japan, South Korea, and the United States that actually provide the best hope of providing a strong bulwark for future deterrence against future war. And that's why it's necessary. That's why I'm so optimistic about the trilateral relationship. I've moved from teaching about theory and practice of alliances to teaching Asian strategies. And from my view, Asian strategies in Japan, in South Korea, in the United States are aligned on this issue. Whether policymakers follow those strategies is another matter, but I see them being aligned. Next, the industrial cooperation is becoming a decisive strategic advantage. A military power increasingly depends on this industrial capacity, innovation, the ability to sustain production during prolonged crises, to work out if choke points are closed, resources are cut off. And that's why expanded cooperation in shipbuilding, building even low-cost drones, munitions, other autonomous systems is going to become so important. Economic security and technological leadership are now basically central alliance missions. And so in my broad sweep of thinking about alliance theory and practice, one of the classic definitions of an alliance is that it's a latent warfare community. It's basically a potential ability to fight a war. But it's in theory until it becomes in practice and needed. That's why most alliances grew out of wars, right? Because they were actually needed to fight the war, and the alliances stayed around afterward, and then they balanced threatening power. But I would argue that today, that's maybe less important than the other new type of alliance, which is basically an active technological and industrial community. It's not theoretical, it's real, and it's now, and it's long-term, because these things are not going to go away. And that's why, despite the political questions, despite proprietary and protectionist, other pressures that militate against this kind of cooperation, the overriding strategic interest is actually to figure out a way to make this work into this active technology community, because the output of that technology community is to create stronger deterrence, stronger prosperity, to create a positive bulwark against coercion, against being essentially co-opted by a wealthy trading nation, and by allowing other countries to get ahead in the technology race that can bring military power as well. Last month was at the SAIS Che Institute for Trilateral Technology Leaders Program. We hosted them at Hudson Institute, and it was a great pleasure to see 30 really smart mid-career Japanese, Korean, and Americans who are building a massive network over time. This is only the third cohort, but give this 10 years, given the fields they're in, that network is going to become a new institution within the ability of this trilateral relationship, because that's the real challenge. We need to operationalize the trilateral relationship. It's still more theoretical than practical. It still has more potential than it's been acted on. But I think if we can build on that kind of institution, and we can have also more officer exchanges and more military exercises that are realistic and more intel sharing, we can actually advance these things. Now, last note, I don't want to end on a negative note, but I do want to still be realistic. I recognize that the United States continues to be uncertain about itself and our role in the world, and that's going to transcend President Trump. I recognize there are going to be issues that as Japan tries to fill a gap, that'll create unintended consequences like concern in South Korea. conversely, I think the need for working with China, however difficult it is going to create anxiety on all of our parts. I don't think, though, my takeaway from President Trump's visit to Beijing was that he did not make any substantive changes on Taiwan policy. That was his opportunity. If he wanted to do it in Beijing, make history. He didn't do it for a reason. Why? Because he understands the strategic interest in maintaining the status quo and not accepting change through coercion or force. He understands that. He's transactional, he wants to negotiate, he does a lot of things wrong and very heavy-handedly, but he understands the basic strategy, and he's trying in the meantime to figure out how do you get allies who have so much prosperity and capability to contribute more to their own defense as well as to the regional defense. And I hear that creates a lack of assurance, that creates anxiety, but it also creates actually strength. And so what we're seeing is a stronger Japan, South Korea, United States, not a weaker one, and I'll end on that happy note. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Cronin, for your insightful presentation. Your central takeaway of your presentation is that alliance must, in fact, strengthen both in capability, also its unity, right, to maintain effective deterrence in the increasingly uncertain security environment. And you also mentioned about the importance of cooperation in military and also economic security. Thank you very much. And now we need to move to the discussion session. And each discussant will have 10 minutes for comments. And our first discussant is Professor Lee Jung-jin from Seoul National University. Professor Lee Jung-jin, please.
Thank you, Professor Kim, and thank you for KAIST and Korea Foundations. And today, thank you, Dr. Oh, for a genuine, stimulating paper. The debate on the South Korea and United States, Japan trilateral tend to oscillate between two unsatisfying modes: tactical crisis management on one and abstract alliance sentimentalism on the other. Dr. Oh's paper refutes both. Its central claim is blunt, and the trilateral is not failing. It is simply being asked to do something it was never designed to do. That reframe is itself a significant contribution. With that in mind, let me turn first to what I see as the paper's most important contributions. And then lay the 5 questions I have. We will sharpen the manuscript further. The paper's most distinctive contribution is its reframing of Korea-Japan friction. Standard alliance scholarships treat that friction as manageable political weather. Dr. Oh, drawing on Professor Jae-sung Jeon's sovereignty game framework, argues this is constitutively wrong. The United States did not merely forge security pacts. It formatively shaped the sovereign elements of both states, encoding distinctive trajectory of sovereign incompleteness. As United States' formative hegemony recalibrates, those suppressed sovereignty games re-emerge with new intensity. The implication, this friction cannot be solved, only designed around. Equally compelling is the identification of allied industrial capacity as the hinge variable of next trilateral architecture. The sovereignty completion energy generating friction between Seoul and Tokyo, competing shipbuilding ambitions, overlapping defense portfolios, are also very capability Washington now urgently requires. Channeled well, the sovereignty game and security imperative converge. Left undesigned, they fragment Moscow and Golden Fleet and Hana, Huntington Ingalls Industry MOU, are marshaled effectively as evidence. Finally, The three design principles in Section 5, hierarchical collaboration, sovereignty-sensitive integration, and resilience against economic statecraft, are well differentiated and practically oriented. The normative capstone that hierarchy must become a means rather than the end is memorable and flow naturally from structural analysis. That said, and precisely because the framework is so ambitious, let me now pose 5 questions I believe it will strengthen. First, on the agency structure dilemma. If Korea's and Japan's sovereignty games are structurally driven by United States hegemonic collaboration, what happens when domestic distrust between Seoul and Tokyo obstruct the conscious design the papers call for? Is industrial cooperation structurally overestimate or is contingent or fight political agency? And if that agency fails, does the framework anticipate coercive United States mandate convergence or strategic fragmentations? Second, on Korea's second sovereignty objective, the claim that Korea's sovereignty gain permanently includes constrained Japan's normalizations is elegant with Professor John's framework. But English-speaking audience may read this as historical grievance rather than structural security concern. Empirical trace from Korea's foreign policy documents or legislative debates showing how this objective manifests in actual territory negotiating behavior would significantly reinforce the argument. Third, the North Korea variable. Korea's division type incompleteness sits at the center of the paper unit-level analysis, yet the DPRK functions as ghost variable. Thus, the escalating DPRK threat risks exhausting South Korea's interested resource on funicular readiness, thereby limiting Seoul's capacity to serve as diversity maritime provider for broader Indo-Pacifics. This is a predictable line of critique that the paper should preempt. Fourth, on institutional governance, sovereignty-sensitive integration presupposes a deliberate division of industrial labor between Korea and Japan. Yet Chip4, Mascara, and NATO IP4 process are largely ad hoc arrangements driven by Washington's immediate needs. What governance body would actually negotiate and reinforce this division? Even a brief sketch of this membership and mandate would make prescriptive section considered more actionable. Fifth, the paradox of Trumpian actionism. The paper draws effectively on Trump administration initiatives as evidence that recollaboration is already undergoing. But the same administration has introduced unpredictable tariff and technology control that cut across allied industrial integration. Is this the intrinsic actionism concentrated on conscious architecture design, or paradoxically characteristic that focus and Tokyo start-up autonomous industry nodes Washington can no longer bypass? These 5 questions are raised in the spirit of engagement with what is already theoretical, robust, and policy-relevant contributions. Dr. Oh has shifted the conversation on trilateral cooperation from sentiment to structure, and that is a small achievement. There is no small achievement. I look forward to his response to our discuss. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Lee, for your thoughtful comments and questions. And our next discussant is Dr. Cho Eun-il from Korea Institute for Defense Analysis. Dr. Cho, please.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Eun-il Cho. I'm from Korea Institute for Defense Analysis. Before I going into my comment, I have one observation of this session because we have three different presenters from different countries and their emphasis are all different. Sovereignty from South Korea and anxiety from Japan and technology from the US side. I think that was a very interesting point for me. And my comments mainly go to Dr. Sashi's presentation. My understanding is that the paper identified three key variables for understanding the current state of the ROK, US, Japan, and trilateral relationship. First is alliance credibility, and the second one is the possibility of the US-China compromise on North Korean denuclearization, and the third point is public opinion in both countries. And I believe that it would be useful to examine more analytically why these three variables are particularly important at this moment. My reason for raising this point is that none of these vectors are entirely new. So rather, all three have been recurring features of regional politics throughout the post-Cold War era. So if so, the key question becomes, why should we pay special attention to these three variables now? The first, regarding alliance credibility, immediately after the Cold War, the US reassessed its strategic posture in East Asia and considered adjustments to its alliance structure. However, the emergence of regional challenges, including the North Korean nuclear crisis, made substantial retrenchment politically and strategically costly. As a result, the basic alliance structure remained largely intact. And both US versus Korea, USFK, and the US versus Japan, USFJ, continued to operate with remarkable continuity. So in this context, the paper raises the question of how regional actors should ensure continued US engagement. Yet I would like to hear more from the presenter about why this question has become particularly salient today. What distinguishes the current moment from the earlier period in which concerns about alliance credibility were also present. And my second point is that I would like to address the issue of the potential US-China compromise on North Korean denuclearization. I am not entirely convinced that the recent development can be characterized as a meaningful compromise between Washington and Beijing. At the same time, it is noteworthy that North Korean denuclearization was not prominently featured in the recent US-China summit diplomacy or in a high-level interactions between North Korea and China. However, I think it is not a new phenomenon. Since the breakdown of the Hanoi summit during the first Trump administration, scholars and policymakers have repeatedly questioned whether complete denuclearization remains a realistic objective and have explored alternative approaches to manage the North Korean nuclear problem. Furthermore, while responding to North Korea's nuclear challenge have long constituted a core rationale for trilateral cooperation, denuclearization itself has not necessarily been the central organizing principle of trilateral relations so far. Therefore, I would appreciate further clarification regarding how the denuclearization issue provides a new analytical lens for understanding the current trilateral relations. And finally, I would like to discuss the role of public opinion in both countries. I know every year various surveys measure South Korean and Japanese attitude toward one another, and scholars frequently debate the implications of these findings. However, I think it is important to assess more carefully the actual influence of public opinion on policymaking itself. In many cases, public sentiment appears to function more as an ex post explanation for policy difficulties than as a decisive constraint on government actions. Particularly in the security and defense field, policymakers often possess substantial capacity to pursue cooperation despite unfavorable public attitudes. Actually, it is my kind of observation from my field. So from this perspective, I wonder whether public opinion should be treated as an independent variable shaping trilateral relations, or whether as an intervening factor whose effects depend on broader political circumstances. I would be interested in hearing the presenter's assessment of how and under what conditions public opinion meaningfully constrains policy choices in Seoul and Tokyo. As a conclusion, my comments are intended to better understand why these three variables deserve particular attention at this juncture. Since alliance credibility, North Korean denuclearization, and public opinion has all been long-standing features of Northeast Asian politics. So I believe the paper would benefit from a more explicit discussion of what makes them specifically, especially consequential in this current strategic environment. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Cho Eun-il. Our last discussant is Dr. Min Jung-hoon from Korea National Diplomatic Academy.
Thank you. Hello, I'm Jung Hoon Mi from the Korea National Diplomatic Academy, KNDA. First, I'm sorry for being late. I got a urgent situation to take care of earlier today. Anyway, I'm so glad to join today's great session and have an opportunity to make productive discussions on the topic. And personally, it's a great honor to have the discussions with Dr. Kranin, and his papers and comments always make me think hard, and they give me useful perspectives and insights. So I always appreciate his hard work, and no exception for today. So basically, I agree with what Dr. Kranin mentioned in his paper about the trilateral cooperation between South Korea, US, and Japan. Like the cooperation among the three countries is important because the three democracies can achieve critical the security and economic objectives more effectively together. So I also believe that the trilateral cooperation needed to be strengthened, but the three countries needed to be focused or prioritized based on changing political and strategic situations that the three countries face. Most of all, we needed to think about the situation where the trilateral cooperation got activated or actively facilitated under the previous Biden government. Sorry, Patrick, again, but we still could clearly remember what happened and achieved in the Camp David summit in August 2023. And after that, during the Biden administration, the trilateral cooperation made significant progress as a presidential agenda. But now we got the different situation where most of the Biden legacy has gone under the second Trump government. And regarding the trilateral cooperation, it could be considered as a Biden child. So, of course, it's still working, but it's not now like a working level agenda not presidential agenda anymore. And the current Trump government put a priority for the bilateral relationship over the unilateral or multilateral relationships. So personally, I'm not sure whether the trilateral cooperation could make meaningful progress under the Trump government, that we still have 2.5 years to go. In addition, I think that the direction of US foreign policy is changing under the Trump government. As shown in their national security strategy released last year, US want to focus on securing its core interests, like restoring its dominant influence over the Western Hemisphere and tracking the rise of China in the Indo-Pacific. And to this end, regional allies like South Korea need to play a more proactive role in coping with regional security threats like North Korea. And I also think that US policy toward China is changing. As Dr. Crane mentioned in the other session at the paper, the second Trump government's policy toward China can be featured as competitive coexistence under intensifying rivalry. So it is likely that US would maintain competition and containment centered on high-tech and strategic industries and simultaneously increase its economic interests by enhancing its trade in non-sensitive products with China. Meanwhile, in the military and security sectors where US has been relatively advantageous, it is likely that US would keep the balance of power and want to achieve a decent peace by avoiding direct military conflict with China and preparing for long-term competition through military innovation and technology development. In addition, as Dr. Crane mentioned, it is expected that US would continue to strategically leverage cross-strait relations. So taken together, these changing political and strategic situations impose challenges and opportunities to South Korea, mainly because South Korea's security and economic interests are based on each bilateral relationship with the US. First, on the security side, in order to cope with the direction of US foreign policy under the Trump government, where regional allies need to cope with regional security threats, South Korea needed to work on the future-oriented strategization of the ROK-US alliance to guarantee its security interests and evolve the alliance into a future-oriented strategic alliance. And the concept of the future-oriented strategization of the alliance shows that the alliance's primary role still lies in airtight defense against North Korea and stably managing security situation on the Korean Peninsula. And to this end, it pursues enhancing South Korean military capabilities and maintaining the defense capabilities of USFK to cope with North Korea's military threats and maintain a stable balance of power around the Korean Peninsula. And in order to ensure its leading role in the defense of the Korean Peninsula, South Korean military needs to lay out a roadmap for strengthening its capabilities and implement it systematically in line with the gradual increase in defense spending. And South Korea also needed to reduce military asymmetry against North Korea and strengthen its overwhelming conventional military capabilities through the early acquisition of nuclear-powered submarines and accelerate the transfer of OPCON through continuous communication and cooperation with the US. So strengthening South Korea's military capabilities will make the security cooperation with the US more balanced and mutually beneficial, and it will eventually contribute to developing the ROK-US alliance into a more reciprocal and future-oriented strategic alliance. So overall, what I mentioned shows that South Korea needed to focus on enhancing its bilateral relationship with US for its security interests. And personally, I think that Japan has got similar situation where it needs to focus on strengthening the US-Japan alliance. So these situations on the security side impose a challenge to the trilateral cooperation, like what roles and how much it can do for the security of the three countries in the coming months and years, specifically under the second Trump government. And second, on the technology side, in order to cope with the U.S. economic and technological policy toward China under Trump government, South Korea needed to secure its future growth engine and competitiveness by strengthening cooperation with the U.S. and technologically advanced countries like Japan and Europe in high-tech and strategic industries. 안미경중, which means aligning with the U.S. for security and aligning with China for economy, and it used to refer to the stance of South Korea between U.S. and China, but it does not work for the country anymore. Of course, enhancing military and security cooperation with the U.S. for the security of the peninsula remains valid and important for South Korea, but economic and trade environments surrounding the country have changed. Now, strategic competition between U.S. and China has been intensified, centered on high-tech and strategic industries, and U.S. want to reshape global value chains and restore its domestic manufacturing capabilities. So given that U.S. holds an advantage in foundational technologies, dominates global capital flow, and leads cooperation in those industries, it is vital for South Korea to cooperate closely with the U.S. to secure its future growth engine and enhance its competitiveness. So South Korea needed to enhance its technological capabilities and strengthen its competitiveness by closely collaborating with leaders in the fields, including US, Europe, and Japan. In the meantime, China remains a major trading partner for South Korea, but the economic relationship between the two countries has been changed from a vertical division of labor to a horizontal cooperative structure or partnership. The era in which South Korea recorded overwhelming exports and trade surpluses with China was over, and China has emerged as a technological competitor to South Korea. So currently, South Korea faces a situation where it needs to maintain both competition and cooperation with China in the economic and technological sectors. And China is also a key player regarding North Korean issues. So it is necessary for South Korea to maintain its bilateral relationship with China amicably by expanding cooperation in substantive fields like economy, technology, culture, and human exchange, while maintaining communication and cooperation for North Korea. So economically and technologically speaking, the three countries, South Korea, US, and Japan, need to talk about how and where the trilateral cooperation can be elaborated to secure their economic and strategic interests together in a multilateral lateral format. And last but not least, for the North Korean issues, the three countries need to think about how they will deal with the North Korean issues. It is expected that South Korea will play an active role as a pacemaker to resume North Korea-US dialogue. As you know, the resumption of summit diplomacy between President Trump and Chairman Kim Jong-un is possibly only left option for improving North Korea-US relations, enhancing inter-Korean relations, and eventually restarting the Korean Peninsula peace process. So South Korea needed to utilize the end of the war in Iran as a turning point for improving relations between North Korea and US. As you know, President Trump recently expressed his intention or willingness to resume summit diplomacy by posting a picture taken with Chairman Kim on social media. So South Korea needed to play an active role to ensure that North Korea-US summit can be realized in the near future. So it is necessary for South Korea to continue to closely communicate and cooperate with U.S. and create more concrete conditions so that Chairman Kim can respond to President Trump's love call. So regarding the trilateral cooperation, so it is about time to talk about what roles the three countries can do for those Korean issues together. More specifically, what roles and contributions Japan can perform along with South Korea and US to make progress for dealing with North Korea. So all taken together, I believe that the trilateral cooperation needed to be maintained and strengthened, but it is also necessary, or it's about time, for the three countries to figure out and elaborate what they actually need to prioritize and work on together under the changing political and strategic situations and environments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Min, for your thoughtful comments. And also thank you very much to all of our discussants for your insightful comments and questions. And now we'll move to speakers' responses. And I would appreciate it if each presenter could limit your remarks to about 5 minutes in responding to the comments and questions raised. Then we'll start from Dr. Oh, please.
Thank you, Dr. Lee, for the 5 questions you gave. Because I only have 5 minutes, I'll just go briefly to answer the question. I think I can answer the first and second questions together in some way. And the first question has to do with if this trilateral cooperation is determined by structural conditions like the US-China power transition, then where is the room for agency of these 3 actors? I think this recalibration, what I call, is structurally pressured by US-China power transition, but also agentially contingent. So I think all of us, the 3 presenters here, are all not opposing trilateral cooperation. But I think I'm just suggesting there is a better way if we take into account the potential underlying sovereignty games that might emerge in a counterproductive way. So we need to be aware of that possibility. And if we take into account that possibility in advance, then we may come up with a better way to recalibrate this trilateral cooperation. And also on substantiating or on the evidence of South Korea's second objective, regarding Japan's sovereignty games, which is to make sure that Japan's normalization does not go in a way that is more aggressive or more militaristic. I mean, Patrick just noted that there's a low probability. I agree with Patrick on that point, but I was just saying there is a public concern regarding that point. So that sort of explains why the Professor Sashi, something that Professor Sashi found interesting about South Korea's preference to trilateral relations to bilateral relations, because presumably South Korean public might assume that U.S. may play a mediating role in case of any underlying or should the concern of the South Korean public would materialize in some way, then United States can get in a way and can play a mediating role as a third party. So, and then also another thing that Professor Sashi found interesting about Prime Minister Takaichi's or the Japanese public's favorability or preference towards a dialogue with North Korea. I think that also has to do with sovereignty case because Japan has no peace treaty with North Korea. And at some point, Japan may want to have some stable relationship with North Korea and Russia as well, although there are some territorial disputes with Russia too. And on the third question is about the North Korean issue. And I think South Korea needs to articulate better regarding our role in how we stand in terms of deterring China and North Korea. So we have been more focused on North Korea, and United States wants us to do more in the first line of naval defense in countering or balancing China. Well, we are all for helping United States to build more ships, and because we have the capacity, and there are things that are going on, and institutionalizing of the breach strategy, briefly written American Maritime Action Plan, but that was more specified in the recent fiscal year 2027 U.S. Navy shipbuilding plan. But I think it's still unclear whether how South Korea would define its role in terms of deterring both North Korea and China at this time. Do we really want that? Or South Korean people may not really want to get entangled in the Taiwan contingency, more so than the Japanese public, I believe. So there's some work to be done on the part of South Korea. And on the fourth question of institutional governance, I think NATO IP4 is something that is not. It was launched by Biden administration, but Trump administration sort of tried to not take seriously at this point. But there's some, incentives for European counterparts and South Korea to, revitalize this, momentum of cooperation between middle powers, between European counterparts. And IP4, there's a Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. So there's some institutionalized framework. It's not an institution, but it's a loose framework where we could take advantage as much as it could. And also, I noted the institutionalization of the bilateral bridge strategy, where the United States wanted to build initial ships in foreign shipyards like Japan and Korea, and bring those ships, initially built ships, back to their U.S. homelands to complete the process of shipbuilding, which may require some sensitive technology and information. So I think there are some institutionalizations going on, but although it is a bilateral one. And on the last question of Trumpian transactionalism, I think it is both. Transactionalism is a constraint at the level of architecture, but also is a catalyst at the level of impetus. So it is, if transactionalism is getting stronger, then our trilateral cooperation may not gain that much traction as we want it to be. But at the same time, it will create a room for focusing on industrial capacity that these three countries can bring together. So that was the reason why I put this industrial allied capacity as the hinge domain, where we could maximize this momentum of trilateral cooperation. I will stop here.
Okay, thank you very much. And Professor Sashi?
Yeah, thank you very much for Professor Cho, but also I really want to thank you for my panelists to give some comments to my presentation, and it was really enlightening. But first of all, I simply want to say, even though I emphasize the anxiety aspect of the trilateral relationship, it was really on purpose. I always try to behave as a devil's advocate. So actually, I agree a lot with what Dr. Patrick Cronin said, and it is very important. But I strongly believe, for us to have some imagination to beyond the realism. So this is my strong conviction. We really have to train our own imaginations to prepare the worst case scenarios. So this is the first excuse I wanted to make. I'm Japanese, so I always want to, we always start our conversation from excuse. Okay, second, thank you very much for Professor Cho about your excellent questions and comments to my presentation. First of all, firstly, you asked me what distinguishes the current moment from earlier periods in which concerns about alliance credibility were also present. Yes, you are right. in the last 70 or 80 years, we allies, experience everything. U.S. protectionism, U.S. lack of credibility, U.S. retrenchment, like in, from Vietnam, moment. And also, we also saw, U.S. did injustice or, inappropriate intervention to regional conflicts in Middle East and in other places. But for me, the worry is really special at this moment in the year 2026. Two reasons. First of all, everything came or is coming at once, right? Protectionism in economic fronts, and also injustice in the Middle East, and also seemingly incredible commitment, political, diplomatic, not militaristic, political commitment to East Asia. So, everything came at the same time. So this is the reason why we have to worry so much, right? This is not because, we don't like President Trump. It is never the reason why we worry so much, right? Every negative aspect of the United States diplomacy or political commitment came at once. So is coming at once. So this is the first reason. And secondly, this is very important, to admit. Now the needs of alliance with the United States is critical than ever, right? More critical than ever. So, we have to worry. This is a very special moment, we cannot believe the commitment, by the reason, as I said, and we really need the United States, more than any time after the war. So this is my response to the first question you raised, Dr. Cho. And the second thing is the issue of a potential US-China compromise on North Korea denuclearization. And she also say denuclearization itself has not necessarily been the central organizing principle of trilateral relations. And also, I believe Professor Min made a comment to Professor Cronin about, and in his comment, Professor Min also mentioned about, Japan's stance on the future of U.S.-North Korea negotiation. But, from my point of view, what I can say here is denuclearization is still very critical in our trilateral relationship. And complete denuclearization cannot be compromised for the sake of, the discussion with Pyongyang. So, we have to be confident what we can expect from the dialogue with North Korea. If not, we shouldn't make a compromise on our very, strong determination to denuclearize the peninsula, and of course, needless to say, the North Korea. Even though I showed the public poll, which are more positive to dialogue with North Korea, I really don't think Japanese public will show strong support for Japan-North Korea dialogue after U.S. and North Korea make some commitments, new commitments, without confirming the principle of denuclearization. So, Japanese public opinion will be really flexible in that point. So I really want to emphasize here, we will not compromise our principle. So finally, about the why we have to take care of public opinion, I think this is the comment I made to Yomiuri Shimbun after public survey. I think, yes, in usual case, politicians don't pay so much attention to public poll, but I think, now, especially our Prime Minister, Sanae Takaichi, she really looks at public poll between Japan and South Korea, about Japan-South Korea relations, because she really knows the strong supporter of her cabinet is younger generation. And these people are really favorable on the bilateral relations. So she is more than sensitive to bilateral relations between our two countries, South Korea and Japan, than any other prime ministers in previous administration. This is just my guess, but I stop here.
Okay, thank you. And Dr. Cronin, unfortunately, I can just give you 5 minutes, so why don't you just summarize your...
Thank you very much. The point that Professor Min made about the Biden administration really generating a new high watermark in trilateral relationship is very important. In the Camp David spirit, including the idea that there was a commitment to consult among the three countries, is a signal achievement and should be maintained, because it's what assures an ability, an institutional ability to preempt or to deal with, to mitigate problems that are going to rise. They're going to come up. What's surprising, I suppose, is that even though President Trump has indeed taken him out of the high-level leadership support for full-throated trilateralism, he actually still supports trilateralism, and his administration is working assiduously on trilateralism. I've seen this both at the State Department, within the Pentagon, and I know that this is reflecting very senior officials' positions. Both Secretary Hegseth, I saw him in Shangri-La, but also Secretary Rubio, who's also the National Security Advisor, fully behind trilateralism. So that's not trivial, and also having President Trump directly involved in something is not always an unalloyed good. That is, there's a double-edged sword to having the President of the United States saying, well, what have you done for me, rather than the focus on what can we do together, the three of us. And I think secretaries and ministers can do that better than sometimes leaders. A second point is that the recognition of what Japan and Korea are providing for security includes things like the defense industrial capacity. So whether it's the Mogami frigate as a model sort of future naval combatant, or everything that South Korea is now able to build and sell, from munitions to ships and beyond, is a significant capacity that shows that these three countries have a common interest in figuring out how can they harness their interests by working together, rather than to see each of them lose market share, each of them lose out the ability to have an industrial capacity that can produce things in a crisis. And I think that's the ultimate test right now. We've seen the United States shoot so many interceptor missiles, in the Gulf War, a war of choice that was unnecessary. We shot down shot so many Patriot and THAAD and other interceptor missiles, and we don't have the industrial capacity to reproduce them. And that's why there's an urgency to trying to build 3 or 4 times more. We still can't do that on our own. We need to work with allies to do this. There's a big question about the enlightened self-interest, about the need to make sure that there is reciprocity. I've had this discussion with the Korean ambassador recently on the fact that there is a lively debate within the United States, inside the Trump administration, over how should the investments from Japan and South Korea be accounted for. Should they only be for American jobs and American-built goods, or should they be made more broadly to make sure that there's enough mutual benefit and interest, both commercially and on the security side, for all parties to achieve success? And I think it's this latter conclusion that the White House has come to. It hasn't been easy to sell, but I think it's been the necessary thing. And we've seen a lot more support from this from members of Congress who understand there has to be mutual benefit in this. That's tough alliance bargaining, by the way. We heard in the last panel a discussion that that's somehow asymmetrical entrapment, or, well, it could be, but it doesn't have to be. It can also be just good alliance negotiation. You just persist, and you have meeting after meeting after meeting. You make your points understood, and you say, oh, that's what you want. Well, okay, we can accommodate that, we can accommodate that, and you make a deal. It's the art of the possible. That's how policy is actually made in reality, and there's no substitute for alliance management and leadership on this issue. Last 2 points, cyber cooperation is a huge part of what's happening trilaterally. This week in Washington, there is an important trilateral cyber cooperation effort underway. When you think about artificial intelligence enabling new cyber, and this is on Korean research recently about how NVIDIA GPUs were being used by North Korea to essentially put into hyperdrive cyber warfare, as well as cryptocurrency theft, you can see why trilateral cooperation is indispensable to dealing with that kind of issue. And then finally, on North Korea and Kim Jong-un, I've made this point elsewhere, but the conditionality that is preventing a renewed summit between President Trump and Chairman Kim is coming from Pyongyang. That conditionality is a sense that there must be recognition of North Korea's nuclear status before we can talk to North Korea. Well, President Trump's willing, wisely or not, to go to a summit without any conditions. But Kim has the condition there. So let's say we can, and I agree, with Professor Sahashi, that we must not make denuclearization a secondary issue, even if we recognize it's a long-term issue. We have to be able to distinguish that. And so if we are able to finesse the language, we collectively, President Trump and President Lee Jae-myung, and whether Kim accepts the finesse language, that we're giving him space to have a nuclear reality at the moment without questioning yet, leave the future just unknown, and maybe Kim accepts that. We then have to decide, yes, what exactly do we want to achieve out of that political declaration that, okay, Kim Jong-un and President Trump both dislike nuclear war. Okay, they put that statement on there. Now South Korea, are you supposed to be like the Gulf allies in Iran? Are you supposed to go in with $300 billion in a reconstruction fund? One, I'm not sure that anybody, including the South Korean public, want to see that happen. And I don't think in Japan or the United States there's going to be any appetite for spending money on a nuclear arming North Korea, even if we want to lower the temperature. We all agree. So I just add that dose of reality to the many challenges. But Professor Min has a really good presentation and paper. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kronig. Unfortunately, I don't think we have time to open the floor for questions from audience since this is already time. But is there any really quick comments from discussion? No? Okay, good. So thank you once again to all of our presenters and discussants and participants. I believe this is a really time when US-ROK-Japan cooperation is attracting increasing attention in both academia and policymaking. So I'm confident that today's discussion provided us with richer and balanced understanding of both opportunity and challenges that three countries face. Thank you very much. Thank you.